In this section, we're going to talk about the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. We refer to him as the historical Buddha because later in the Buddhist tradition, a wide variety of different Buddhas with different special characteristics develop, spread across time and space. And we want to highlight here that we're talking about definitely a historical person who lived about 2,500 years ago. He was born into a family that controlled a small region in this part of India. And we have in this image over here a story about his mother who has this dream where a white elephant enters into her side. And she takes that as an auspicious symbol that the child that will be born will have a special kind of destiny. This is in some ways parallel to something like the birth of Jesus, but there are some really significant differences because in the case of Jesus, you need a kind of a miracle for Mary to be impregnated. Whereas in this case, we need to keep in mind that we have an existing theory of reincarnation or rebirth. There's a slight difference that I'll talk about in another lecture. And because of that, the idea that some kind of element, whether we call it a soul, Buddhists won't call it a soul, they'll just talk about kind of mental aspects of the person that carry on from one life to another, that for everybody they would enter into some new womb to be reborn. So there's nothing particularly miraculous here. The main point is really the symbolism of the white elephant. Elephants are considered very auspicious, and they're associated with royalty, and the color white with purity. So the idea is that when his mother had these dreams, that they were interpreted in a very auspicious way. But they were also interpreted by the specialists, the Brahmin priests who were consulted, to mean that the child that was to be born would have a destiny that would go one of two ways. Either he was going to grow up and be a very important political leader who would unite India, or he would do something similar in the religious realm. And although his mother died just after he was born, his father took this to heart and decided to raise him in a way where he was surrounded with luxury. And the idea was that he would be connected to, attached to the worldly life and would therefore choose a destiny that would lean towards being a political leader. Fate, of course, intervened, either literally or not, and we have this other story with the so-called 4 sights, where young Siddhartha goes out on 4 consecutive days, and he sees these 4 different things that shape his decision to leave the home life and go searching for spiritual fulfillment. And the first of these is an old man. He sees an old man, and he asks his charioteer, why does he look all kind of, old and wrinkly and all of that? And the charioteer says, well, that's a natural process. It will happen to everyone. It's going to happen to me. It's going to happen to you. And the Buddha is interested in this, and instead of going on to the pleasure park where he was going to enjoy his afternoon, he goes back to his palace and he contemplates the nature of old age. We have the subsequent days. He goes out, he sees a sick man, he asks the same kind of questions, gets the same kind of answers, contemplates the question of sickness. On the 3rd day, he sees a dead man, and the same kind of story is repeated. Goes home and he contemplates the nature of death. And then finally, on the last day, he sees a shramana, somebody who has left the comforts of home and the connections with family and society to go wandering around and practicing spiritual exercises in the hope of attaining some kind of awakening. And so through that process, the Buddha decides, or the future Buddha decides, that he will take that path, and he's 26 years old. He has a newborn baby, but he leaves the family behind. Of course, the wife and child will be taken care of. He's already, in a sense, done his duty from an Indian perspective of producing an heir, and in some sense that frees him up to go on and pursue the religious life. Now, we can talk about this more in class, so I want you to think about the symbolism of this story, in particular the aspects of old age, sickness, death, and then the final decision to leave home in pursuit of something else. But the key idea that I want you to focus on for now is just to realize that this is a kind of a myth. Whether it literally happened is pretty doubtful. It's hard to imagine a 26-year-old never encountering old age or sickness or death. So the real focus here is not on the faith that this is a true account of events. And once again, we see distinctions between the Western traditions and the Eastern traditions, where in the West, the literal belief in certain aspects of certain stories is what's important. Here, that's not at all important. Don't focus on whether this really happened or not, because that wouldn't have been any particular concern to anybody. Focus on the symbolic meaning of the story. Why does he see these different things and that sort of cause him to take the path that he takes? So we'll talk about that in class. For now, let's move on, see what he does after. He goes on and he encounters a couple different groups that are practicing meditation, and he learns their techniques and masters meditation, and then decides that although he's mastered the particular techniques that they have to offer, that he still hasn't attained the fundamental goal that he's seeking, this kind of awakening. And so he decides to go even further and practice asceticism. You can see in this image that he gets incredibly thin. Asceticism is something that challenging the body for spiritual purposes. You might think in a simple way of something like in Lent, Catholics will give up certain things. That's a kind of asceticism. Or to take a more radical version from Christianity, some people might whip themselves and carry around a cross and try and feel the things that Jesus might have felt on his journey towards his crucifixion. So that kind of physical challenging of the body for some sort of spiritual purpose. I don't want to get into a lot of detail about the Indian context, but let's just say that in India this was a well-established practice, so he was joining groups of people that were engaged in similar kinds of practice. And the idea is something along the lines of that you've accumulated karma from your previous lifetimes and this lifetime and all of those actions. And by performing asceticism, such as eating small amounts of food or holding one's breath for a long period of time or standing for long periods of time, that these things were believed to burn up the karma so that you could make faster progress towards enlightenment. However, after doing this for a while, the Buddha, or future Buddha, realized that he was bringing himself to the point of death, which you can see clearly illustrated in this image, and that therefore it didn't make sense to go on. And so he moves on to the next and final phase in his spiritual quest, and that is that he takes a moderate amount of food and sort of replenishes his body, and the idea there is that body and mind need to be healthy and stable in order to accomplish what he's seeking for. And then he finds a tree by a river, and he makes a vow to stay practicing at that tree until he attains awakening. And he does that, and that tree still exists. It's called the Bodhi tree at a place called Bodh Gaya, and this is the place where the Buddha is supposed to have attained his awakening. And so he practices diligently. He applies some of the techniques of meditation that he learned from the meditation masters, but he also develops his own. And that is the practice of mindfulness. Many of you engaged in the mindfulness meditations that we offer here as part of your contemplative exercise. And so that practice of focusing on the breath in order to stabilize the mind, that's the beginning of what he did in order to attain awakening. He does, however, go on to to focus on some key philosophical and religious issues once his mind is stable. So the idea of that kind of mindfulness is just to stabilize the mind, but once it's stable, he's able to see into past lifetimes, to understand the process of karma and rebirth, and thereby realize what is the cause of suffering and bring it to an end. With that said, he attains awakening. Look, you can see the enlightenment shining forth from him. And I'm going to leave it there for now. So please go over that material and reflect on it. And I'll come back in the next mini lecture and we'll talk about the ideas that he developed and especially the first sermon he gave on the Four Noble Truths.